So tonight we're going further with our study of personal identity. And last week we really concentrated on what I'm calling expressive individualism, which is not my term, but it's used quite broadly now, for the view that you look exclusively inward to find yourself. And last week we put that to the test and it came up short. I judged it to be fragile, not leading to a stable and satisfying sense of self, to be failing, not leading to the good life, and also to be faulty because it doesn't take into account the fact that we're social beings, we're storytelling beings, and we inevitably look up. We have eternity in our hearts, if you like. So in the next 2 weeks, tonight and next week, we're going to look in two other directions to find yourself. Tonight, we're thinking about, as Lewis said, narrative identity. So looking backwards and forwards. Now, narrative identity is an important topic for all sorts of reasons, and we'll proceed in a few moments with it. But first of all, I want to think about, does the Bible actually treat the subject of identity? If you look up in English concordance, most modern translations of the Bible don't actually use the word identity. So it's a difficult one to answer. Does the Bible treat identity? Well, I think actually it does. And I've given you two readings. Last week's reading was an article I wrote comparing Adam and Eve's transgression and the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, and the way in which really Adam and Eve's sin could be characterized as expressive individualism, if that's not too cheeky. And then this week you read my forthcoming Dictionary of Paul and His Letters article on identity in Paul's letters, which is a burgeoning field of study, as you'll see if you have a look at that paper. But you can actually find the word identity in the New Testament and in the Old Testament if, like any good principle of a Bible college, you put it in there. So the Greek words for life and soul in particular can be translated, I think, as identity. So we just read from Colossians 3. There's a wonderful line in there which I think is very significant. We'll return to that passage in a little while, where it says your life is hidden with God. You could translate that, your identity is hidden with God in Christ. So Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, if you're going with my translation option, said your identity is more than food and clothing. You're more than Homo economicus. And then in Psalm 19, it says the law of the Lord refreshes your true identity. And then finally in Romans 12 verse 3, we're told actually to think about ourselves with sober judgment. That's what we're trying to do on these 3 nights together. Another book I'd mention is by Larry Siedentop. He's got a book called, it's a tour de force, called Inventing the Individual. And the very notion of an individual, he traces back to the Apostle Paul. The notion of ourselves as free agents, an essential notion for the very idea of personal identity. He writes, in the Apostles' hands, the identity of individuals is no longer exhausted as it once was by the social roles they happen to occupy. Now, this is quite remarkable because New Testament studies, which is prone to wild swings of a pendulum, has gone from saying the New Testament says nothing. The ancient Mediterranean cultures say nothing about individuals. It's all about communal personality and corporate existence and social ties and groupings. You know, anthropology and the social sciences have invaded New Testament studies. But the truth is, there is this tension in the New Testament between the individual, which, according to Siedentop and other thinkers, has formed the Western view of the individual, and corporate or communal identity. In my article on identity in Paul, I deal with that briefly in the book of Romans. So if we keep moving, we can think together about this notion of looking backward and forward. In other words, our lives are stories. So that's what Jonathan Gottschall says. I'll talk about his book a little bit later. Our life stories are who we are. They are our identity. And Tim Keller writes, everyone lives and operates out of some narrative identity, whether it's thought out and reflected upon or not. And Alistair McGrath has said, the story we believe we are in determines what we think about ourselves and consequently how we live. So I'm putting to you tonight to find ourselves, along with looking around to others and within, we need to look backwards and forwards to our life stories. Now, your story then is fundamental to your personal identity, but it's not an individual story, at least not exclusively. Being social beings, we live in shared stories. So it's a mistake, I think, to think that our life stories are simply our own making and played out in isolation from others. The meta-narrative or big story in which each of us lives is a combination of defining moments and goals and expectations related to stories handed down to us by our families and related to the stories of our nations, ethnicities, social classes, and religious faiths. Now, I've got a borrowed computer tonight, and I have a horrible feeling it's running out of gas. We'll see how we go. If something happens, I'll return to you on my phone. Don't go away. Okay, so the notion of shared stories is something I want us to think about. So how could it be that my story, just to speak personally, could begin before my life? Now, my father was born in Vienna in Austria from a Jewish family. He was an only child. As a young teenager, he and his parents fled to Shanghai in China, where they had an international settlement in 1938, fleeing Nazi terror. All three of them became Christians. And soon after their arrival in China, in 1949, he immigrated to Australia, met my mother, and then I came along 10 years later. So it's in fact quite common for family histories to have an impact on your identity. In my case, my father's history affects a number of things about me, my attitude to education, which my father missed out on, to refugees, to Jews and Judaism, to European history and culture, to playing chess, certain food, music, and so on. A lot of our memories, if you like, are second-hand memories. They're the kind of things that still form us because they're part and parcel of who we are. What I put to you is that there are two basic big stories that most people are living in the West today. And what I'll do in the rest of the lecture is to evaluate those stories and then to give you a different story, which I think is a better one to live in. So the two big stories are the story of secular materialism and the story of social justice. Both are fueled by the movement of expressive individualism. And like any good story, they have a basic plot and setting, key turning points, central themes, stock characters, conflicts to be resolved, and an anticipated climax. While they are understandably attractive in various ways, I think both are seriously flawed. And as life stories go, they're ultimately unsatisfying because they have a truncated view of human nature and, in my view, a distorted view of reality. So these two big stories are like literary genres that house a number of subgenres. So just as the genre of drama comes in crime, teen, horror, and legal versions, and comedy might be black, romantic, slapstick, or in Lewis's case, droll, under secular materialism, we need to consider certain subgenres: Enlightenment progress, the sexual revolution, and consumerism. Obviously, we're going to do this briefly. And under social justice, we need to treat the narrative of the marginalized and those of their allies, sometimes called the woke. I don't like that term because it's really it's a culture war term. And then those who are supposedly the oppressors. So the story of secular materialism is where I want to start. And it's a story of Enlightenment progress. So the Enlightenment saw human reason as the pinnacle of history, and the implementation of science and technology would hasten a better future. And as Tom Wright puts it, the myth of progress fails because it doesn't in fact work. It would never solve evil retrospectively, and because it underestimates the nature and power of evil itself. So for each of the stories, these narrative identities, they've got a beginning, a middle, and an end, which is what they'll tell you in any English classroom in high school. And they have a problem to be solved, There are past turning points. There's a present struggle. And unfortunately, I couldn't get another P. There's a future hope. So if someone can help later with the fourth P, that would be very helpful. Something about prospect, perhaps. That doesn't quite work. So the problem for Enlightenment progress are constraints on personal freedom. The past turning points are the Renaissance and the Age of Reason. The present, thanks, Lewis, the present struggle is progress through the development of science, technology, and education, and the future hope is the triumph of reason and, obviously, enlightenment. The problem we're addressing with Enlightenment progress is the stagnation and subjection of the preceding periods of human history and their lingering effects on the present. The word Enlightenment gives a clue to the movement's self-characterization as emerging from darkness, in particular the Dark Ages, although less pejoratively, the Middle Ages, I think, is a better description of that period. But in this view, history was a register of crimes, a tale of cruelty and cunning, a record of unremitting conflict, and we need to move past that. We do that through education and technology. Religion is part of the problem from the Dark Ages, and its supposed demise is part of the story as well. The present struggle is really about, through the development of science, technology, and education, humanity coming of age and casting off its immature and primitive past. And its future hope is nothing short of a grand vision of human flourishing in the future. Now, most people subscribe to some form of this, even though they wouldn't necessarily enunciate it in those terms. Immanuel Kant, major Enlightenment thinker, wrote that the proper destiny of human nature lies in such progress. And I think the word destiny is really significant there. Each of these stories has an eschatology, if you like. Now, my critique is pretty predictable here. I think the language of Enlightenment has broad appeal. Obviously, reason and science, technology and education have brought enormous benefits to individuals and society. I'm probably standing here tonight because of medical science. I haven't had terrible things go wrong, but I've had some things go wrong. At the age of 62, who knows? I'm still in reasonable health. 100 years ago, I would not have been. C.S. Lewis called it chronological snobbery, thinking that earlier times were always inferior. And that thinking on the wrong side of history, as one of the phrases, is rife in our society. The problem is that Enlightenment, the conviction that reason will lead to an infinitely better world, especially in moral terms, has been proven dead wrong. If you look at the early 21st century and the 20th century, you've got glaring testimony that humans remain cruel in conflict. We had 2 world wars, chemical weapons, nuclear armament, mass genocides, continued poverty, environmental degradation, and so on. And reason has not gutted religion either, as the decline was predicted. So I think the Enlightenment progress has real problems. It's really a view that puts on rose-colored glasses, forgets about the past, and doesn't weigh it up accurately. Another subgenre of secular materialism is the sexual revolution, which took place really in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and with which we're still going strong, of course. The problem there is sexual repression of the moral codes that have constrained sexuality and sexual conduct in the West from the Dark Ages and stubbornly survived until the 1950s. The past turning points were things like Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis, which thought that many of the problems have to do with repressed sexuality in the human species. A second turning point was what I'm calling the pain and pleasure paradigm. Sometimes worldviews are summed up very simply in broad brushstrokes, as the West is driven by guilt and innocence, Arab and Asian cultures by honor and shame, and some animistic cultures by fear and power. Interestingly, by the way, Adam and Eve in Genesis 3 are guilty, ashamed, and afraid. But there's a fourth paradigm that I think is taking over. I've read this in a number of missiologists. It's the pain and pleasure framework. As we judge every issue on the basis of whether it will bring us pleasure and reduce our pain. I mean, the euthanasia debate is driven by such thinking, along with the premium put on personal autonomy and choice. The third thing is the pill. The birth control, the contraceptive pill, was approved for mass use in the 1960s in the US, made casual sex less risky, and broke the nexus between sex and pregnancy. The present struggle is not that hard to understand. It's that sees it struggle against the imposition of anything from the outside the individual, from previous generations, from religion and politics, which limit sexual expression. And the future hope is sexual emancipation. Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, goes into this in great detail. And the hope is to produce a society where no one falls short of their authentic expression in all matters sexual. Now, my critique is pretty simple. I'm reducing this down. There's much more to be said, of course. But I think defining your existence in terms of your sexuality is a rather limited view of the human condition, and making sexual release the purpose of your life, to say the least, is quite tiring. It's also an excuse for self-centered behavior. So what we end up with, you become totally virtuous by being totally selfish. If sex is all about personal pleasure, it ignores the other key dimensions of sex, namely procreation and partnership, if you like. I got 3 Ps there. And it's led to all sorts of things that are, everyone would agree, are untoward. Violence in pornography, the terrible phenomenon of sex before kissing for young girls in many cases, single people not able to have sex for a range of reasons are also roadkill with the movement. The third subgenre I want us to consider about secular materialism is not coming up on the screen. Okay, so maybe I could ask Lewis to advance that slide for me. The third one is consumerism. And here we're thinking of the overarching meta-narrative that purports to explain reality in the 20th century, namely the free market economy. In the beginning of this narrative, you've got the self-made, self-sufficient human being. At the end, this is Susan White, of the narrative is the big house, the big car, the expensive clothes. And in the middle is the struggle for success, the greed, the getting and spending in a world in which there is no such thing as a free lunch. Most of us have made this so thoroughly, notice the language, our story, that we're hardly aware of its influence. The problem is, it depends where you are on the scale of material things. In everyone's case, it's about financial security and independence. Some people are from the wrong side of the track, so to speak. Some have the struggles of an immigrant family. Every generation thinks it should be better off than the previous generation. And now aspiration's hard to speak against, and it can have good motives, of course. But the consumerist view of the world is much more all-encompassing. Now, if you can move, oh, there we go, it's starting to work again. So the problem is falling short of material prosperity. The past turning points are the rise of capitalism and the achievement of material goals. The present struggle is the accumulation of possessions, financial security, enjoying life to the full, and the future hope is material comfort and happiness. Now, my critique is that in the end, and I'll do this very briefly for sake of time, money and greed are gods that fail. They don't bring us the significance, security, and satisfaction that each of us craves. So on my next slide, I've got just those words. Idols are gods that fail, be they human progress in general, sexual fulfillment, or material possessions. So that's kind of secular materialism. 3 subgenres. We move briefly and cautiously to social justice. Now, social justice is, there should be another slide in there, but there isn't. So we'll move there in a moment. But social justice is, of course, a more ambivalent one for us, because the Bible very clearly speaks of looking after the marginalized and the oppressed, especially those who are disadvantaged. So unlike the story of secular materialism, social justice is attractive to many Christians. To many Christians, and I think for good reason. Zechariah 9 chapter 7 verses 9 and 10 says, "Administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to each other. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor." I mean, my own upbringing ingrained in me a antipathy towards racism and xenophobia, just because of my father's history and where we lived in the western suburbs of Sydney. So this is something I'm very attracted to. But does the story of social justice work as a comprehensive narrative identity? Basically, social justice divides the world into 3 groups: the oppressors, the oppressed, and their loyal allies. Yep. Now, if you're used to reading the media, the culture wars language for this is the oppressors, the woke, and the victims. Yep. So those terms are a little bit ambivalent now, and so I prefer not to use them. The problem is injustice against various minority groups, and that prejudice and discrimination could have to do with race, gender, or sexuality. They're the big ones in our day. The key turning points, the kind of defining moments in the past for this narrative, are the struggle against injustice. So egregious examples of historical injustice and marks of progress. So if we think simply of racism in the US, for example, you would say that the past turning points are things like slavery, segregation, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., police brutality, hate crimes. And on the other hand, the civil rights movement, interracial marriage, a black president, and so on. So these kind of defining moments from the past are the past turning points. The present struggle is clearly about addressing discrimination and prejudice in all its forms. And identity politics is sometimes thought to be what's happening here, where groups of people form alliances based on skin color, race, gender, sexuality, or so on, and press for action on their concerns and grievances. And the future hope is to rid the world of these evils and to bring a grand vision of a transformed society in which the world is put to right. Now, what do I think of the story of social justice? Personally, I judge the story of social justice to be an inadequate basis for narrative identity. For all its good intentions, it has serious fault lines running through its foundation. It can lead to an unhealthy sense of entitlement. It's divisive, and it offers an incomplete diagnosis of what is wrong with humanity. Although its transformative vision of the future is inspiring and worthy, it lacks the means to get there. Now, this could be the full 45 minutes and more. I'll just give you a few points of about what I'm getting at. The story of social justice does divide humanity into goodies and baddies, if you like. And what that tends to do is it makes the victim status, the person who's oppressed or marginalized, a very attractive one. So there is a rising number of people who claim Indigenous or First Nations heritage for themselves on dubious grounds. This is documented by people of Indigenous heritage. This is not someone of white privilege talking from the outside. In the US, they're known as race shifters. In Canada, they're called pretendians. And in Australia, they're called box tickers. One Australian academic of Indigenous background writes that in Australia, the race shifting phenomenon is pervasive and well recognised by Aboriginal people. The race shifters hold the power, they stifle debate, resist scrutiny, and attack Aboriginal people who ask who they are in cultural terms. It's complicated, is the first point to make. The other thing to say is that the idea that prejudice and discrimination are all that is wrong with the world and confined to one group is really absurd. The distribution of human evil is far deeper and wider. All three supposedly discrete groups I put to you, the oppressed, their allies, and the oppressors, have their distinctive failings. The oppressors may well be prone to prejudice, discrimination, bigotry, and nepotism. The oppressed, though, can easily fall into a place of irresponsible laziness and entitlement, destructive envy and bitterness, and their allies can be guilty of self-righteousness, bullying, and groupthink. And all three groups should be wary of pride, greed, sexual exploitation, selfish ambition, corruption, violence, deception, ruthlessness, malice, and raw self-interest. Human evil is the original, diverse, and inclusive industry. And the story of social justice just doesn't seem to admit that. The biggest problem for the story of social justice is that in underestimating the breadth and depth of human evil and restricting it to one group of oppressors, it only creates new injustices and also engenders a naively optimistic view of the future. The world will not be put to right simply by opposing multiple forms of prejudice and discrimination, as unjust and ubiquitous as these may be. What we need is a truly radical transformation of the world and its inhabitants from out with ourselves, to use my favorite Scottish preposition. The letter of James puts it really well. It confronts injustice, the oppressive rich, and then it also says to be patient until the Lord comes, the judge is standing at the door. So you bring these two together, and that's what you have with a more satisfying, I think, worldview, where we're directed in James both to look to God to bring justice to the earth on the last day and to allow that hope for justice of the kingdom of God to permeate our lives now by caring for those in need. So to put it really briefly, the story of social justice puts on very thick lenses and blinkers, and everything is bracketed out apart from discrimination and prejudice, and everything is seen through that light. And the story of enlightenment progress really puts on rose-colored glasses and forgets the nature of human evil and puts too much optimism in the basket of technology and education. Now, the life story of Jesus Christ, just in 5 minutes, is what I'd like to put to you as a different narrative identity, which in the end, in my view, is a better one. Now, Colossians 3 and 4 said it very interestingly. You died and your identity is now hidden with Christ in God. Think about that. We tend to think as evangelicals that Christ died as our substitute. Here we have the teaching that Christ died as our representative. We died with Christ. So you have this idea that the defining moment of my life's narrative is my death with Christ to self-interest and sin, and my rising with him on the last day being revealed as a son of God or a daughter of God. As it says, when Christ, who is your life story, that's my translation, appears, then you will appear with him in glory. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the famous German martyr, put it this way. It's more important for us to know what God did to Israel and in God's Son, Jesus Christ, than to discover what God intends for us today. The fact that Jesus died is more important than the fact that I will die. I find my salvation not in my life story, but only in the story of Jesus Christ. So I think that's really what I'm putting to you, friends. And really the most surprising thing about the story of God's people, the narrative identity that the Bible gives us, is that it's based on the template of someone else's life, namely the life story of Jesus Christ. The story of God's people is the ultimate indictment of the heart of expressive individualism, because it asserts you don't have it within yourself to define yourself. you need an intervention from outside. The first two stories underestimate the problem that afflicts individuals and society and are overly optimistic about how to fix it. The third story, the life story of Jesus Christ, is both the bleakest and the brightest. When it comes to genuine and lasting change, we human beings do not have it in ourselves. We're as good as dead. Thousands of years of human history confirms this. But the good news is that a dramatic intervention has taken place and a date has been set for its final and complete transformation. So unlike other stories, the story of God's people based on the story of Jesus Christ has both structure and closure. And it's important to note, we are not the stars of the show. So you can either be a star in your own life story, which I put to you, the genre of which will be either a tragedy or a farce, or you can play a bit part in a much bigger story, the redemption of the world. So the life story of Jesus has the same structures we've looked at. The problem is pervasive evil. The past turning points, as I've suggested, are the death and resurrection of Jesus, our substitute and representative. The present struggle, we could talk about this, and I've written elsewhere, are an enduring wilderness and exile opposing evil. And the language of Paul says we put on Christ, which I think is really about putting on his life story. You see this, of course, in baptism and the Lord's Supper. It's exactly what they're about. And the future hope is the resurrection of the body and the new heaven and the new earth. As Galatians 2:20 puts it, I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So here's this language of us dying with Christ, our defining moment. Our defining future also sets our story in place. And then I think the notion of a signature move is an important one. We saw this in Colossians. So basically, you see this quite often when someone does something, you just think, oh, that's just so Lewis, yeah, or that's so Esther, that's so Lauren, yeah. So the signature move of the Christian is the move of love, which sums up all things, because it too is related to our defining moment, namely our death to self-interest and sin. Now, don't get me wrong. There are things that happen in our lives. It's not that all the other identity markers are irrelevant or of no consequence. If you're a believer in Christ, your race, your gender, your family, occupation, your marital status, all of these are important, but they're not all important for your identity. The life events and experiences you have will have a lasting impact on your identity and conduct. But at the most profound level, if you're a believer in Christ, what sets the course of your life and keeps it on track is your identification with Christ and imitation of him. Now, we need to do a critique of the life story of Jesus Christ, and we've just got a couple of minutes. So basically here, friends, what you've got to admit is that we don't always stay on track with the plot. Yep, when a Christian behaves really badly, they've lost the plot. That's what's happened. And what we need to do is to get back on track with our bit part in God's bigger story. So I think that as a Christian, why am I still a Christian? The closest I've come to giving up the Christian faith has been to do with the behavior of other Christians. Sometimes Christians behave so badly, it's so discouraging. The only two things that keep me going are this. One, that the story of the Christian faith is both better and worse than we could ever imagine. That's a CPX documentary you may have heard of. The origins of the Western values of human rights, charity, humility, non-violence, all go back to the teaching and influence and example of Jesus. The other thing that encourages me, friends, when thinking about a critique of the life story of Jesus Christ and people living it, is that the Bible itself does not hide the fact that religious people can behave badly. And it has the resources for reforming them. And at its heart, we have the notion of confession of sin. So if we had time, we could ask, how does the life story of Jesus Christ play out against the tests that I introduced you to last week, the tests of the good life? Yep. And I think the death and resurrection of Christ and the story itself is one that can lead to the good life, as we've called it. I'll close with this. Tom Wright put it this way: we live in a world where increasingly people are clutching at straws, unable to glimpse a story which would lead the way into true peace, freedom, and justice. The Christian gospel offers such a story, but to tell it truly, you have to be living it. And that's the great challenge, of course. It's one thing to know about the life story of Jesus Christ, but living that story is what each of us needs to do. Now, a few books to keep you interested. The first 4 are my books, which is really quite lame and self-promoting. Known by God is one that I've spoken about a couple of times. Most of the material I'm presenting in these 3 lectures comes from a book coming out next May, How to Find Yourself, Why Looking Inward is Not the Answer. And my friend Carl Truman wrote the foreword for that one. I have a book on greed as idolatry, Paul's little phrase in Colossians and in Ephesians, which is really a book about consumerism. And then a more popular book called Beyond Greed. And then I mentioned Larry Seaton-Topp's book, Inventing the Individual. And Gottschall, Jonathan Gottschall, has written, it's a popular book, but it summarizes a lot of very solid scholarly work. The Storytelling Animal, How Stories Make Us Human.